All right, Shabbos, say good morning. We have another incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Lamed Beis 132, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. We are picking up actually right in the bottom of Kuf Lamed Aleph and Beis, right in the bottom of 131b. 2 lines up from the bottom, right at the 2 dots. We thank our sponsor. We thank Selma Wolf for dedicating the shiurim this week in the Zechus of Refuah Shlema for her daughter Naomi Bas Sarah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Chole Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. And Abosai, with that, let us begin. So if you remember again, we're still in the sugya of Machshirei Mila. So right, Abosai, so remember again, speaking about the fundamental machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, but we found out already yesterday that it's not really Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, rather it's Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the world, right? Which again, Rabbi Eliezer is saying that halacha l'maisa is not only Mila that's Docha Shabbos, but it's Machshirei Mila, even the preparatory acts for bris that are Docha Shabbos, whereas Rabbi Akiva says no, it is only Mila itself that is Docha Shabbos, but again, not the Machshirin. The Nafkamina, this Moel doesn't have a knife, and the only way for him to get a knife is either to make one or to carry one. Rabbi Eliezer says absolutely okay. Rabbi Akiva says absolutely not. We'll have to wait until Sunday. We then saw in yesterday's daf that the interesting discussion regarding Machshirin spans a variety of other mitzvos as well, but even Rabbi Eliezer does not allow for Machshirin in every case, but rather only in certain ones. And with that, let us continue. So says the Gemara, Mila, the Chol Machshir, Adochanas HaShabbos to Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that bris Mila and all the Machshirin, right, all the preparatory acts for bris Mila are Docha Shabbos. So the Gemara says, now interestingly enough, after like days of this discussion, what does the Gemara finally say? By the way, Minale the Rabbi Eliezer ha. Where does Rabbi Eliezer know this from? Where does he know that Mila and Kol Machshira Docha Shabbos? Imi Kulhu Gamar Kidar. If you want to say that he learns that from all the other sources, remember again yesterday we went through a number of different cases where, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Machshirin are Docha Shabbos. Right? We saw lulav, we saw matzah, we saw sukkah. Omer, Shtei Halechem. So if you want to say it's from all of those cases, Kedar Minon, you can't say because all of those cases have unique aspects which really prevent them from serving as a source to learn out something else. V'od, Ma lahanach top of Kuf Lamed Beis, Ma lahanach shekenim avers mana batla. I will say furthermore, Mila is fundamentally distinct than all those other mitzvahs. Why? Because all those other mitzvahs, what happens if halacha l'maisa, you forgot to put up your sukkah for 7 days, and sukkah is over, you're done. You forgot to bring the shtei alechem on Shavuos, you're done. You forgot to bring the carbon omer, you're done. Right? You forget to go and take lulav, Mila is not like that. Although ideally Mila takes place on the 8th day, but if you did not offer up Mila on the 8th day, what's the halacha? You do it whenever you can. So what is Rabbi Eliezer's logic in that he allows Mila Machshira on Shabbos, the Amakra, Ubayom Hashmini Yimol Basar La. So, Vafilu B'Shabbos. Shabbos again, Rabbi Eliezer makes the drasha, which interestingly enough, we're going to see this drasha is almost universally accepted, just the application of it varies. Ubayom Hashmini, you will do the Mila on the 8th day, and what do we darshan Yom Hashmini? Afilu B'Shabbos. Even on Shabbos. Meaning, whenever the 8th day falls out, that's when you're going to do the bris Mila. V'lichtov Rachmana b'Mila v'leisu hanach v'ligmar minei. So if that's the case, okay. So bris Mila, B'Yom Hashmini teaches me even on Shabbos. So why do we make bris Mila the paradigmatic example of something for which the mitzvah and machshira docha Shabbos, and learn out all of the other cases from bris Mila? Mishum de'ikal mifrach, because I will say you could bring a pircha. You could ask, meaning you could point out that Mila has a unique aspect that nothing else shares. Namely what? Ma'alamila shekei nichresu aleha shlosh esrei brisos. I will say Mila is different because there are 13 covenants that were affected around Mila. And I will say, now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Yir Gimel Brisos, Nemru li Avram beParshas Mila. So we'll say, what the Gemara is saying over here is the word bris is mentioned 13 times in the section concerning bris Mila by Avram Avinu. So the Gemara understands that to mean that Rimon Shalom created, so to speak, 13 brisos, 13 covenants, ultimately again around 13 covenants around bris milah. So therefore, again, so they both say because so since you have a mitzvah that has 13 divine covenants surrounding it, then halacha lamaisa, then halacha lamaisa, it's a unique mitzvah, and therefore cannot really serve as a paradigm for anything else. Good. So we'll say so that's bris milah. So far now, so here's what we've accomplished. What we've accomplished is we've shown, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Milah, as well as a number of other mitzvos that are docha Shabbos, and not only the docha Shabbos, but they're machshirin, right? Machshireha, their preparatory acts are docha Shabbos as well. So says the Gemara, let's go weiter. Ad kan lo pligi rabbanan ale ele b'machshirei milah. So now the Gemara is going to take a step back. Fine. So now what we've highlighted over the last over the last 2 days is that there's a fundamental machlokes by machshirin. Right, that's abundantly clear, right? So can you go ahead and specifically for Milah, can you engage in the preparatory acts to allow for bris milah on Shabbos or not? Rabbi Eliezer says yes. The Rabbanon say no, and we see that this machlokes spreads out amongst many other mitzvos as well. But yet, interestingly enough, the Gemara says the machlokes is only about machshirei milah. Ava milah gufa divrei hakol docha Shabbos. But I will say, interestingly enough, everyone agrees that bris milah is docha Shabbos, which is really very interesting. Everyone agrees bris milah is docha Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, well, minalan, from where do I know that? From where do I know that bris milah is docha Shabbos? So Amar Ula halacha. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so what we're going to see, you say, here's what's great about a Gemara like this, which is the conclusion we know. What's the conclusion? Milah is docha Shabbos. Okay, so that no one's disagreeing with. Milah is docha Shabbos, at least for now. The interesting machlokes is going to be, where do I learn that concept out from? So says the Gemara, watch this. So Ula is the first opinion, and Ula says halacha. It's halacha l'Moshe misinai, that milah is docha Shabbos. V'chinamar Rabbi Yitzchak halacha. Rabbi Yitzchak says halacha l'Moshe misinai. Okay, may say Gemara says, really? Is that true that milah is docha Shabbos halacha Moshe misinai? Here we go. Minayin lepikuach nefesh shedocha Shabbos. From where do I know that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos? Right. So we'll say, how do I know that if chas v'shalom there's a threat to life, that I could be mechal Shabbos in order to go ahead and save my life, or save someone else's life? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Omer, ma milah, shi achos me'ivarav shel adam dochas Shabbos. So listen to this. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, milah only affects one part of the body, yet it's dochas Shabbos. Kavachomer lepikuach nefesh shedochas Shabbos. We'll say it's a pretty good, interesting kavachomer. So if milah, which only affects one part of the body, is dochas Shabbos, pikuach nefesh, which impacts the entire body, is certainly dochas Shabbos. But here's the problem. So we'll say good kavachomer, but halacha. If you assume that the reason why milah is dochas Shabbos is because it is a halacha l'Moshe misinai. But it's a very interesting fact. This is what I love about Daf Yomi also. You pick up like these very interesting facts along the way. Apparently, a halacha l'Moshe misinai cannot be used for a kal v'chomer, which actually makes a lot of sense. Why? Because there was, remember again, what's a kal v'chomer? So kal v'chomer says, if you find an element that applies in a kal case, right, in a mitzvah, which we'll call it is quote unquote lenient, then certainly you could apply that same concept to something that is more stringent. A halacha l'Moshe misinai defies those categorizations of kal and chamer because it's just given directly by a Kodesh Baruch Hu. It's halacha l'Moshe misinai. Very often halacha l'Moshe misinai are categorized differently. Therefore, the Gemara says like this: what you just told me is that Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, you're learning out the license to violate Shabbos for pikuach nefesh, to save a life from bris milah. Just like you could do bris milah on Shabbos, and bris milah only affects one part of the body, and you could be mechal Shabbos. Certainly, you could be mechal Shabbos to save an entire body. That's a great kal v'chomer. Except Ula, if you're correct, and the way we learn out that milah is docha Shabbos, Isra halacha l'Moshe misinai, then you cannot go ahead and use that as part of a kal v'chomer. After all, V'hatanya, we learn Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, or Amar lo Rabbi Elazar. It changes it over here. Amar le Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Kiva, right? Etzem kiseora mitame halacha. So we'll say the concept that etzem kiseora, right? If you have a bone that is the size of a seora means a kernel of wheat. Then what's that? Then what's the halacha is mitame? it is metame. And we'll say, so where do you know that from? That is a halacha l'Moshe misinai. Furthermore, revius dam, that a revius of dam could go ahead and be metame. That's a kal v'chomer. Ve'in danin kal v'chomer mehalacha. And what does this talk about? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Akiva. Etzem kisora halacha. Shay Rabbi Akiva dan kal v'chomer. So we'll say Rabbi Akiva would make the following kal v'chomer. Now watch this. Minayim l'revius dam. Shames shanazir megalech al ohala. So we'll say, how do I know that if, for example, let's say a nazir comes in contact with a revius of blood. He's under the same roof with a revius of blood. How do I know that totally undermines his neder nazirus? He has to start all over again. Kal v'chomer. So Rabbi Akiva said kal v'chomer ma etzem kisaor sheinu matami ba'oel nazir megaleach amagoma. So we'll say if you have a little bone fragment that's the size of a wheat kernel, right? So, or a barley kernel, I should say. So even though that does not convey tumas ohel, if a nazir comes in contact with that, he does have to restart his nazirus. Revius dam shematame ba'oel d'chsiva kol nefesh meis lo yavo eno din shanazir megaleach aleh. Certainly, again, a revius of dam which is matame ba'oel, a nazir will have to start all over. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says to Rabbi Akiva, we don't make kal v'chomers from halacha l'Moshe misinai. So we'll say, so again, the only reason the Gemara is just trying to point this out is because this backs up the principle we just said, namely, you can't make kal v'chomers from halacha l'Moshe misinai. So we'll say, just follow the flow over here. So Ula is saying, how do I know that milas docha Shabbos halacha l'Moshe misinai? Really? Because Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah used the fact that milas docha Shabbos create the kal v'chomer, that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos as well. But if milah is halacha l'Moshe misinai, he says the kal v'chomer. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rabbi Elazar asya os. Rabbi Elazar says, you're right. Rabbi Elazar says it's not halacha l'Moshe misinai. Rather, it's gzeirah shava. Gzeirah shava of os. Both sides it says by bris milah os, right? And it says ultimately again by Shabbos that Shabbos is an os. Just like Milah is an os, Shabbos is an os, so therefore Milah is docha Shabbos. Ela me'ato tefillin d'chsev b'hem os lidchi Shabbos. Well, tefillin also has the word os in it. It says, right, tefillin is also a sign, right, of a covenant between Chosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael. So you're going to tell me then that tefillin are also docha Shabbos? Ela asya bris. But rather, again, the Gemara is a different gzeirah shava. It says bris, right? It says bris ultimately again by Milah, and it says bris by Shabbos. So therefore, again, Milah is docha Shabbos. So the Gemara says, 1 second, Gadol d'chsiv bei bris lidchi Shabbos. So we'll say, interestingly enough, where does it say bris by Milah? It says bris by an oral zachar, by an adult who does not have a bris Milah. So then again, maybe all it's saying is, what kind of bris is docha Shabbos? The bris of an adult is docha Shabbos. But who says that the bris of a baby is docha Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Gadol d'chsiv bei bris lidchi Shabbos ela asya doros. Rather, the Gemara says, you're right. And make a gzeirah shava of doros. It says doros ultimately again by bris milah, and it says doros by Shabbos. Therefore, again, milah is docha Shabbos. So, okay, the Gemara says, well, tzitzis d'chsiv bei doros lidchi Shabbos. Well, it also says the word doros by tzitzis. So maybe again, tzitzis should be docha Shabbos as well. Maybe you should be able to tie tzitzis on Shabbos. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So we'll say Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, no. Here's the drasha. Danin os bris v'doros me os bris v'doros. La fuke hanach dechad hu dichsiv b'hem. It's supposed to be very interesting. So this is actually a different kind of gzeirah shava. That Shabbos and bris milah have 3 common denominators. That by Shabbos it says the word os, bris, and doros, and by milah it says os, bris, and doros. That creates a connection between milah and Shabbos. Say that milah is docha Shabbos. But all the other things that shared commonality with Shabbos, for example, like tzitzis or tefillin, only shared one of those words. Therefore, they're not docha Shabbos. Milah, which shares all 3 of these common characteristics with Shabbos, will be docha Shabbos. Okay, a third opinion. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra Bayom afilu b'Shabbos. So Rabbi Yochanan says the drasha. He says the pasuk says ubayom hashmini, and on the 8th day. And Rabbi Yochanan says bayom hashmini comes to say even if the 8th day is Shabbos, that is when you will do the bris milah. Armali Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Well, if that's the case, Elami Ata Michusare Kapara Dichsiv Behu B'Yom Hachenami Dedachu Shabbos. So we'll say if that's the case, that in other words, we'll say so. Rabbi Yochanan's drasha seems to be as follows: that when the Torah uses the lashon of Bayom Hashmini, that is a definitive, declarative statement. Bris Milah happens on the 8th day, meaning what? No matter when the 8th day falls out, Bris Milah will be performed. So even if Bris falls out on Shabbos, you'll still go ahead and do it on Shabbos. And says, okay, that's interesting. Well, there are other situations where the Torah uses the word Bayom as well. For example, Michusari Kapara. Now we'll say, look at Rashi, which is called Michusari Kapara. Kol Tzemeim Shehutzruchu Lekarban. So we'll say, remember, there's a whole group of people who are Tameh, who still require the offering of a karban. Who are those people? Zav, Zava, Yoledes, Mitzora, Ne'emar Bahen, Ubayom Hashmini. So we'll see, interestingly enough, it's the same lashon. These people have a 7-day tumah period, and on the 8th day, they have to offer up their karban. Bayom Hashmini. So you're going to tell me now Bayom Hashmini of Bris Milah says that Milah is Docha Shabbos. Okay, are you now going to tell me that Bayom Hashmini of Michusari Kapar, Michusari meaning people who have to bring their karbanos, that you could bring those karbanos on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Hahumi Baile Bayom V'lo Balayla. No. The Bayom Hashmini by Michusari Kapara teaches us that what? That their karbanos can only be offered up by day and not at night. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami. I'm sorry. So why don't I say the same thing by Bris Milah? Why don't they say that Bayom Hashmini by Bris Milah also teaches me what? Not that Milah is Docha Shabbos, but rather what? That Milah can only be done by day and not by night. To which the Gemara says, I learned that from another place. Hahu mi ben shmonas yomim nafka. I will say the fact that Milah can only be done by day and not by night, I learned that out from a different phrase. The pasuk says, Mi ben shmonas yamim. By day, that teaches me Milah can only be done by day. Hainami mi bayom tzavaso nafka. So by Michusari Kaparabo said there's another phrase, biyom tzavaso. So I could learn out biyom tzavaso to teach me that Michusari Kapara can only offer up their carbon by day. That frees up Bayom Hashmini by Michusari Kapara to teach me what? That it's Docha Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Hainami biyom tzavaso nafka. Afagav de nafka mi bayom tzavaso. It's true. Even though by Michusari Kapara, you could learn out that the karbanos can only be offered up by day from the phrase Yom Tzavaso, it's stricha. I still need the Bayom Hashmini to teach me that it can only be done by day. Why? Sakadai Tamina, Holo v'chas Rachman Allah la'asuye bedalos, balayla nami leisei. Because Rabbi say Michusari Kapara are very interesting. In what sense? That Rabbi say, by Michusari Kapara, by these situations of the Zav, the Zava, the Yoledes Mitzora, they're unique in the following aspect. There is a financial sliding scale for the bringing of this carbon, right? If you're wealthy, you bring one kind of carbon. If you're poor, you bring a different kind of carbon. Now, I will say, now, what does that tell you? What does that tell you? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to make sure you bring that carbon. Whether you're going to bring an animal, you're going to bring a bird, you got to find a way to bring that carbon. So I'm at a thought that since the Torah Kedosh is so insistent on the bringing of that kind of carbon, that maybe that carbon is unique in that it can be brought by night as well. Kamash Malon Bayom Hashmini comes to re-emphasize the point that what? The Bechusari Kapar, those karbanos can only be brought by day and not by night. So therefore, Abosai. So therefore, remember, just keep our eye on the ball of it. Rabbi Yochanan's shita is, how do I know that Milah is Docha Shabbos? Bayom Hashmini. Simple drasha. On the 8th day, Bayom Hashmini, afilu b'Shabbos. Milah must take place on the 8th day, even if it is Shabbos. Maskif lo Ravina. So Ravina said, 1 second, if that's the case, Ela me'ata yehi zar kasher bahen, v'ye onein kasher bahen. So this is actually very interesting. And again, the Rishonim kind of ask on this, because it's a very, very, very strange havamina. But if the Torah is so insistent on the karbanos of the Michusari Kapara being offered, so perhaps even people who are normally unfit to offer up other karbanos should be able to offer up these karbanos. For example, a zar, a non-kohen, right? An onen, a kohen in avelos. or some other unfit Kohen should be able to go ahead and offer it up, to which the Gemara says, Ahadrekra. Therefore, the Pasuk once again repeats it to say, no, that this halacha, these karbanos, although HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts incredible emphasis on them being brought, are regulated by the same halachas of any other karbanos. So it can only be brought by day, and ultimately only by Kohanim who are kshered. So we'll say, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Another opinion. So we'll say, remember again, all you're seeing over here is we're going to see at the end of the day probably a 4 or 5 way, I think a 4-way machlokes about how you know that Milah is Docha Shabbos. So the good news is the conclusion is agreed upon. Everyone agrees that Milah is Docha Shabbos. Remember, the machlokes is only by machshirin. We're just trying to figure out where do I know that Milah is Docha Shabbos? Reb Achar bar Yaakov Amar Kra Shmini Afilu b'Shabbos. So we'll say, interesting, it's a little bit of a different. So remember again, whereas Rabbi Yochanan was focusing on Bayom, really the Bayom Hashmini, on the day of the 8th. And Milah has to happen on the 8th day, on the day of the 8th, even if it's Shabbos. So Rav Acha Shita is we focus on Shmini. Torah says it's got to be on the 8th. It's got to be on the 8th. So Shmini Afilu b'Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Hai Shmini mi bar leila me'utei shvi. 1 second. No. I need the word Shmini to teach me something else, which is what? We'll say a very important drasha, which is 8 and not what? Not 7, right? So I need that. And again, Shmini can't teach you that it has to happen on Shabbos. So we'll say Shmini teaches me a very important halacha, namely that bris milah. Remember again, that's why Bayom you could hear Rabbi Yochanan's drasha. Bayom is a shtickle extraneous, right? Because again, Bayom is coming to emphasize something different than Shmini. Shmini's teaching me it's got to be on the 8th day, not the 7th. They can't teach me Shabbos. So the Gemara says, no. Shvi mi ben shmonas yomim nafka. I can learn out that Milah can't be on the 8th, on the 7th day, because there's another phrase that says, Mi ben shmonas yomim. I v'akhati mi boy lechad leme'utei shvi'i, v'chad leme'utei tshi. No, both say, listen to this. I need both. I need Bayom HaShmini, right? I need Bayom HaShmini, and they also need Mi ben shmonas yomim to teach me 2 halachos. One teaches me that Bris Milah shouldn't happen on the 7th day, and one teaches me that Bris Milah shouldn't happen when? On the 9th day, di'im echad, because if I would have just had one of those phrases, hava amina shvi'i hu delo mataz maneh, I might have thought the bris milah can't happen on the 7th day. Why? Because the zman has not yet come. Ava mishmini ve'elech, but from the 8th day and on, zmanehu. We'll say the havamina by milah is, I would have thought as follows. How does bris milah work? So halacha, you can't do it before the 8th day. But once you get to the 8th day, what's the halacha? You're good. In other words, 8th day and on. So therefore, again, what happens? So therefore, again, the Gemara says, I need both phrases ultimately to teach me. You can't do the 7th, but you also can't do the 9th. The mitzvah is really day number 8. Ella nichavarta kid Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara says, out of all the drushes, who do we like best? The winner is Rabbi Yochanan. Bayom Hashmini. Bayom Hashmini teaches me, Bayom Afilu b'Shabbos. So the Gemara says, furthermore, Tanya Kavosei Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brayso that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Udulo kirav Achar bar Yaakov. And not like Rav Achar bar Yaakov. Shmini Yimol Afilu b'Shabbos. So again, the Gemara says, on the right Shmini Yimol, the baby will be circumcised on the 8th day, even on Shabbos. The Gemara says as follows: Uma ani mekayim mechala mos yumos. And when the Torah says those who are mechala, we'll say 1 second. Remember, Milah is a malacha. We'll say, remember, what's Milah? Milah is, interestingly enough, is the malacha of shchita. Because what's the malacha of shchita on Shabbos? Is anything that draws blood. Right? If you cut yourself, meaning intentionally cut yourself on Shabbos, that's shchita, right? You draw blood on Shabbos, that's shchita. You hurt someone on Shabbos, that's shchita. So Lemaisa, again, going ahead and doing bris milah is the issue of shchita. So therefore, what do I understand? Mechalamos yumas. The Gemara says, b'shar malachas chutz mimilah. That comes to include all other malachas except for bris milah. Or maybe it even comes to include bris milah. And perhaps when the Torah says that circumcision occurs on the 8th day, maybe that means the 8th day but not Shabbos. Talmud Lomar Bayom Afilu b'Shabbos. Therefore the Torah says not just Shmini but what? Bayom HaShmini. And that extra word Bayom comes to teach me that Milah takes place even on Shabbos. The drasha of Rabbi Yochanan Amar Rava. So we'll say the Gemara says, Rava says as follows, Hi Tana. So we'll say it's interesting. In this brisa over here, the Tana seems to be working through like a thought process. So Rava says, I want to understand the thought process of the Tana. Hi Tana me'ikara ma'kanechale ulabasof ma'kakashele. What is it that the Tana thought was obvious in the beginning, but then he then thought was questionable at the end? So watch this. Hachikamer. This is, we'll say, this is the kind of, now we're going to look in the inner workings of that brisa. Watch this. Hachikamer. Shmini malafilu b'Shabbos. So we'll say, first I would have thought that when the Torah says you do bris on the 8th day, it means even Shabbos. But what do I do? Amani mekayim mechalaleha mos yumas. But what do I do with the phrase? The fact that the Torah says if you perform malacha on Shabbos, you chayiv misa, and bris mila is chilul Shabbos, to which the Gemara says b'shar malachas chutz mimila. So I would have said, okay, very simply, it refers to all other malachas other than bris mila. Aval mila dachya, but mila is docha Shabbos. Why is mila docha Shabbos? My time. Kavachomer. I will say, watch this. Now this is a whole nother world. Kavachomer who umat tzaras shedoches havoda. So we'll say tzaras is docha avoda. Now what does that mean? So we'll say take a quick look at the last Rashi on the daf before we turn the page. As harish as so king tzaras shedoches shabbos. As harish is here Torah al tzaras shelalokutz bera. So Rabaharto kidichisanya hishar benegat tzaras. Asar bekotz bera. Supposed to listen to this. There's a halacha that says. There's a passage that says, "Hishamar benegat tzaras." Be very careful with tzaras. I will say now what we darshan over there. That means is you are not permitted to cut off your tzaras lesion. Think about this just a moment. I get a questionable blemish on my arm. I don't want to deal with this. What do I simply do? Cut it off. Cut it off. Easy, probably painful, but at least it's done. That is an Isser D'Oraisa. You are not allowed to cut off your negat tzaras. So I will say. So based on that, we see something quite interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa tzaras is doche avoda. What does that mean? Take a look at the rest of Rashi. Rashi says over here. Take a look. V'echmira Torah ba'ashar zulitchos avoda k'dikam l'psachim. The tumas meis nitchis b'karban sibor v'lo zavin u'mitzaran u'b'teilim lazos pesach v'lo meis chesresa. Let's listen to this. Interestingly enough, if 51% of the tzibur are tamei, so tuma hutra b'tzibur, and you could offer up communal offerings in a state of tuma. Right? Yet, interestingly enough, Rabbi say if 51% of the people are mitzora'in, chas v'shalom, so tzaras is not hutra b'tzibur. So you see that tzaras is docha avoda. So if a kohen is a mitzorah, the avoda cannot be done. And even if the majority of kohanim, even if all of the kohanim are mitzora'in, you can't do avoda. So you see that tzaras is docha avoda. Now watch this. This is the first part of the Kal Chomer. Umat tzarash doches avoda amud beis ve'avoda doches haShabbos. And yet Rabbi say no that avoda is docha Shabbos, right? Because remember again, I can engage in sacrificial service on Shabbos. So watch this. Mila. So the Gemara says Mila docha osa. I'm sorry. V'avoda doches haShabbos. Mila docha osa Shabbos shenitchem ne'avoda. Eino din shetei mila docha osa. So we'll say, now watch this. So the Gemara says, now Mila is docha tzaras, right? Mila docha osa, right? So we'll say, now follow this train of thought. What does he mean, Mila's docha tzaras? Let's say a baby has tzaras on the arla. Now, we have a problem. What's the problem? The problem is, the pasuk says, you're not allowed to cut off an egg, hishar benegat tzaras, but I have to do bris milah. I have to do bris milah. So the halacha is that Mila is dochet sarah. So we'll say we'll see where this comes from. But halacha l'maisa you could cut off the arla even though that is the cutting off of tzaras. So we'll say now you hear the kavachomer. So watch this. So tzaras is docha avoda avoda is docha Shabbos. So therefore Mila, which is dochet tzaras, certainly is docha Shabbos as well. So the Gemara says, "Eino din," right? Eino. So it's Mila docha also. So Mila is docha tzaras. Shabbos shenitches minei avoda. Shabbos is set aside because of avoda, and avoda is set aside because of tzaras. So therefore, if Mila sets aside tzaras, Eino din shetehe Mila docha osa. Certainly, again, Mila should be docha Shabbos. Umayo Eino dekamar. I will say so. Therefore, again, what was the second thought of the Tana? Hada Amar umimai de tzaras chamura. Maybe it's not that tzaras is more chamer. Dilma Shabbos chamura. Maybe Shabbos is really more chamer. Shekin yesh ba'onshin vaz haras harbe. Because after all, again, Shabbos has many associated lavim. Umimai mishum de chamira tzarasi. And why is it ultimately again that we're focusing on the chumra of tzaras? Mishum Gavra Hu Delo Chazi. So I will say maybe the fact that Saras is Docha Avoda is not because Saras is more Chomer than Avoda, but very simply a Kohen who has Saras is simply not fit for the Avodah. It's not a question of Chumrah. Both sides to say that if the Kohen has any other kind of mum, he's not fit for the Avodah. So Saras just falls into that category of mumin that disqualify a person from Avodah. Domushim Gavra Hu Delo Chazi. Umani Mekayim Shmini Yimo Chutz Mishabes. And I both say, therefore, again, perhaps when I look at the pasuk of Shmini Yimo at the end of the day, how do I interpret that? Maybe that means yes. Normally, the bris milah on 6 out of 7 times, milah takes place on the 8th day. But if it falls on Shabbos, you won't do it on Shabbos. Talmud Lomar Biyom Afilu B'Shabbos. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh the Gemara says Bayom Afilu b'Shabbos. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, so again, we just walked through the whole back end of the brisa, but came out to the same conclusion. Because remember, again, this brisa was quoted as a support to Rabbi Yochanan, where Rabbi Yochanan makes the drasha of Bayom Hashmini, really focusing on Bayom, on the day, Afilu b'Shabbos. So we'll say that is the drasha out of the, so we had a 4 machlokes as to how you know that Milah is Docha Shabbos. The Gemara chooses the drasha of Rabbi Yochanan as the preferred drasha. So let's go a little bit weiter. It's really quite interesting. Tan Rabbanan, Milah Docha Satzaras. So I'll say, just this as an aside, by the way, this notion of a baby having tzaras is also quite interesting, right? Because remember, again, we know tzaras clearly is a divine message. So it's also fascinating. Like tzaras means one thing for people. Tzaras habatim means something else. You know, if you have tzaras in your home, like Rashi says, Rashi understands it as according to the Gemara, understands it's a good sign. There's treasure buried behind the walls. Others see it in different ways. So it's Rashi. I didn't have a chance to look into it last night, but I'm looking into it a little bit. Like what would be the hashkafa of that if a person has a child with tzaras? I don't know. So the Gemara says as follows: This is actually very interesting. Remember again, there's a milah bismana, milah shelo bismana. Milah bismana means an 8th day milah, an 8th day milah. Shelo bismana means, let's say, for whatever the reason the bris was delayed, that would be a milah shelo bismana, a milah not at its appointed time. So the Gemara just points out over here that milah's dochet saras, whether the milah is happening on time or delayed. Yom Tiv eino docha ela bismana. But however, Yom Tiv, and of course Shabbos, it is only a milah bismana. That is docha Yom Tiv and Shabbos. Well, it's a very important halacha that, remember, which makes sense, because where are we learning out? Where are we learning out that milah is docha Shabbos? Where are we learning out from? According to Rabbi Yochanan, Bayom Hashmini, which tells you that when is milah docha Shabbos? Only when it's an on-time milah, 8th day. But the Gemara says over here, if it's a delayed milah, what we call a milah shelo bismana, it will not be docha Shabbos and Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, Yom Tiv eino docha ela bismana. So bilvad. Hani mili. So we'll say, where do we know this from? Where do we know all of this from? So the Gemara says, Yimol ditan rabbanon Yimol b'sar arlaso ve'afa pi sheyesh baheres yakutz. Because we'll say the pasuk says, and again we're focusing still on saras. So how do I know that Allah l'maaseh, even if there's tzaras on the makom milah, that I am permitted to go ahead and cut off the tzaras? And I will say, obviously, my intention is not to cut off the tzaras. My intention is to give the baby a bris milah. But again, de facto, I'm cutting off the tzaras. How do I know that I'm allowed to do that? Because the pasuk says, Yimol b'sar arlaso. You circumcise the arla. V'afapi sheyesh sham baheretz yakuts, and we darshan from that. Rabosai, you cut off the arla, and whatever's on the arla is on the arla. So if there's saras there, not saras there, it doesn't make a difference. You can cut it off. Umani mekayim ki shamar benegat saras. But what do I do with the pasuk that says you must be careful with saras, which Rabosai is the injunction, is the prohibition to cut off saras. Bishar mekomos chutz mimila. Ultimately, again, it is on other parts of the body. It's on other parts of the body except for bris milah. Except for bris milah. So the Gemara says, "Oh, eino ela afilu milah." But how do you know that? No, maybe not. Maybe hisham benegat tzaras means, Rabosai, that you can never cut off tzaras on your body, even if what? Even if it's on the makom milah. Umani mekayim mimam basar lasa. 1 second. If that's the case, Rabosai, so if it's true that Hishamar Benegat Tzaras means you can't cut off Tzaras. Even if what? Even if it's on the Makom Milah. So then what do I do with the phrase Yimal Basar Lasso? So we'll say, just to understand, the way the Gemara is interpreting that phrase Yimal Basar Lasso is that like it's a, what's the word? It's like a, not carte blanche is the wrong word, but it's a non-exception clause. In other words, there's no exceptions to that. Yimah Basar also means the way you give a bris milah is you cut off the arla, and whatever else happens is totally inconsequential. So that's how we're darshaning it. But maybe not. Maybe ultimately the prohibition of Hishar Menagat Tzaras, not cutting off Tzaras, applies to even Tzaras that's on the arla. To which the Gemara says, Tamulomar Basar Afapi Sheyeshem Bahares, because the pasuk says you shall cut off the flesh of the arla, meaning you cut off the flesh. No matter what is there, you're taking off that arla. So if there's saras on it, you're going to take off the arla anyway. Amar Rava, so Rava says, Hai Tanim, so Rava says, same thing. So Rava sees in this discussion, this back and forth, like a deeper thought process, which Rava wants to explore. He says, Hai Tana, me'ikara my nechale, ulebasof my kashale. This Tana, what was obvious to him in the beginning, yet that bothered him in the end? What changed? So watch this. Hachi Kamar. This is what the Tana meant to say. Yemal b'sar arlaso v'afapi sheyesh baheres. Really, I would say as follows. You can give the baby a bris milah, even though again there's saras on the arla, and when you end up giving him the bris, you're going to end up taking off the saras. Umani mekayim shomer negazas. I want to do with the pasuk that says you have to be careful with saras and not remove saras. Bishar mekomos chutz mimila. So the way I would have darshan this, the way I would have kind of made shalom in the world, is to say, Yimal basar arlaso tells me you give the baby a bris milah no matter what. No matter what. What about hishamer benegat saras, that you can't cut off saras? That applies where? In every single other case except bris milah. Okay, so there's one exception to the rule. Not so crazy. So the Gemara says, Aval milah doches hatzaras. But ultimately, again, milah will be dochet saras. Now why? My timer. Now watch this. So here we go again. Here's the kavachomer. Uma Shabbos chamura milah docha osa. So Shabbos, which is very chamer. Shabbos in general, which is very chamer. Yet milah's docha Shabbos. Saras lakol shekin. So we'll say all the more so saras, which is not as chamer as Shabbos. So we'll say the Gemara gives an interesting kavachomer here. If milah could be docha Shabbos, and Shabbos obviously is very chamer. So if milah could be docha Shabbos, milah could certainly be dochet saras, which is not as chamer. To which the Gemara says, "Ma Shabbos chamura milah dochosa saras l'koshkin umay o eino dekamar." So we'll say, so what was then? What was the reverse thinking? So watch this. Hadar kamar mimay de Shabbos chamira. Then the Tana said, well, 1 second. How do I know that Shabbos is more chamer than saras? Dilma tzaras chamira. Maybe tzaras is more machmir. After all, why? Shekin docha es havoda. Because also remember again, tzaras is docha avoda. What does it mean tzaras is docha avoda? If the Kohen gets tzaras, he cannot go ahead and do avoda. So maybe, and yet, va'avoda docha Shabbos. Yet Rabbi say what? Avoda is docha Shabbos. So maybe tzaras is actually more machmir than Shabbos. Because saras is docha avoda. Avoda is docha Shabbos. Rabbi say if A equals B, B equals C, then A equals C. And therefore again, so therefore that means what? That ultimately again, saras is more chamer than Shabbos. To which the Gemara says, va'avoda docha es Shabbos. Tamul omar basar. Therefore, Abba say the pasuk says basar. Afapish yesham baharet. So again, we go back to a very simple drasha. The drasha says, remove the flesh, the basar. I don't care what's on it. I don't care. Remove the arla. We do not pay attention to anything on the arla. The only thing we are preoccupied with is the removal of the arla itself. And even though there may actually be some saras on that arla, lishnachrina, both say different version of this exchange. Mila doches saras, my taima. Interesting. Why is it that mila's dochet saras? So why is that the asiyase v'dachi lo sase? As Rabbi say bepashtos, the asay of bris milah comes along and pushes aside the lo sase. The lo sase, ultimately again of tzaras. Look at Rashi. To the Gemara says asiyase v'dachi lo sase. My time milah dochet tzaras. The asiyase diimol v'dachi lo sase dihishamer lecha. Dachi kamer leperakivah must asiyase v'dachi lo sase. Fine. So the asay of bris milah sets aside the lo sase of tzaras. To which the Gemara says, "My eino de ka'amar hadar ka'amar." Then he had a reverse thinking. Amar darminan asi asay v'daki lo sasay greda. I will say it is true. In general, in halacha we say that a positive commandment could come and overrule a prohibition. Asi asay v'daki lo sasay. But interestingly enough, when is that so? That's only when it's a regular lo sasay. But hi asay v'lo sasay. I will say, interestingly enough. So tsaras has both an asay and a lo sasay. If you look at Rashi, hay asay v'lo sasay, shamar lo sasu, the last kechala shayoru. So we'll say, listen to this. The removal of tsaras is not only a prohibition, not only a lo sasay, but it's an asay as well. Ooh. So now we have a problem. Because now bris milah is an asay. So normally we would say an asay is docha lo sasay. But by tzaras, it's not only a lo saseh. The tzaras is a lo saseh vaseh. 1 second. So I'll say ultimately an aseh cannot set aside a lo saseh vaseh. So now we have a problem because now maybe bris milah doesn't set aside tzaras. So mani mekayim imal b'sar laso bisman shein baba heres. And maybe again when we say that you have to take off the arla, when is that? When there's no tzaras on the arla. Talmud lomar basar. Right? I will say it's great. Everything comes back to basar. Right? Just basar. Remove the flesh. Remove the foreskin. And I will say, ultimately, again, it doesn't matter what's on the basar, it doesn't matter what's on the arla, just take it off. So the Gemara says, Talmud basar v'afapi sheyesh sham b'haras tinach godol dirsev b'hu basar. And this is very interesting. So that's fine by an adult who's getting a bris milah, because we'll say by an adult, the Torah uses the lashon of basar. Right? The Torah uses the lashon of basar. Katan namik sivbe basar. By a baby, in other words, an 8-day-old, it also uses the lashon of basar. Yet, interestingly enough, Beinoni minalan. So we'll say this is actually quite fascinating. Look at Rashi Beinoni. Kegon shalo bizmana v'lav bar onshin va'aviv mitzavah. So let's listen to this. So the Torah speaks about milah in different contexts. There's an 8-day-old baby milah. There's an adult who is uncircumcised, who still has to circumcise himself, who has the obligation for himself. And then there's an older child. Now, an older child, obviously, before bar mitzvah, the obligation of milah is still upon the father to perform it. So the Torah used lashon of basar by a baby, lashon of basar by an adult. So I understand basar teaches me that what? Milah's dochet saras. But what about by a Beinoni, what he calls a Beinoni, meaning a child who's not 8 days old, but also under 13 years old? How do I know that milah, where there is no lashon of basar in that context, is dochet saras? Amar Abaye, asya mebinei. So also ultimately we learn it from a common denominator between Katan and Gadol. Migadol lo asya shekin anush kares. So we'll say on one hand, I can't learn that from a Gadol because again, once you're over 13 years old and you don't give yourself a bris milah, chayiv kares. Mikatan lo asya shekin milah bizmana. From a baby, you can't. 8-day-old baby, you can't learn it out. Right? You can't learn it out. Why? Because that's a milah bizmana. Hatzad hashavas shebahen shekin nimolin v'dochenes hatzaras. So we'll say the common denominator between an 8-day-old baby and an adult is what? They both have lashon of basar, which teaches you that their milah is dochet saras. That creates a halacha by bris milah to teach me af kol shenimulin dochet saras. So to again, any time that there is a circumcision, that bris is docha Shabbos. So, I'm sorry, that bris is docha tzaras. So Rabbi say halacha lamaisa. The Gemara is going to say it was created a common denominator between the bris of a baby, bris of an adult. To teach you even the bris of the Beinoni is docha tzaras. Rava Amar mila bizmana lo tzricha kra. Rabbi say so. Rava says, interestingly enough, Amila Bismana doesn't really. So we'll say, so therefore again, halacha lamaisa, what we've proven is Mila is dochet saras. How we get there is subject of dispute. Again, it seems to be that the most widely held approach, or the most widely held drasha, is basar. Right? Basar tells you that ultimately, again, take off the foreskin no matter what is on it. So Rava says, so the Gemara says as follows. Rava Amar Mila bizmana docha lo tzricha kra. So we'll say actually we're going to stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Mirat Hashem with this Gemara with Rava Amar. Let's see Shekayach. Incredible sugya. Shkoyach.